much for joining us today. This is a joint event between the Royal Society of New Zealand and Sir Richard Friend's currently in New Zealand, giving a series of public talks on the Royal Society 2012 Speakers Series. He's been travelling around New Zealand, Christchurch, Auckland, Hamilton and Dunedin. Today's the last day of his tour. He's speaking at 6 p.m. tonight at the Wellington Town Hall to a sold-out theatre. So we thought we'd bring him here so you get a chance to meet him and ask some questions and hear from him as the tickets have all been sold out. Now, Sir Richard is the Cabinet Professor at the University of Cambridge, and this is a position once occupied by Ernest Lord Bulliford, the New Zealand connection there, and he was also the Tan Trinh Tuan Centennial Professor at the National University of Singapore until September last year. Sir Richard has pioneered the study of organic polymers and the electronic properties of molecular semiconductors, and his works led to the development of LEDs, photovoltaic cells, and which have been used to develop flat panel displays and screens. He's a founder of the Cambridge Display Technology Limited, the leading developer of commercial display technologies based on polymer light-emitting diodes. He's a co-founder of the spin-off company Plastic Logic, which is developing flexible electronic displays on plastic sheets. And more recently, he co-founded a company to develop low-cost flexible solar cells, 819. He's one of the principal investigators in the new Cambridge-based interdisciplinary research collaboration, IRC, on nanotechnology. He's also a council member of the UK Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. So, thank you, Sir Richard Friend.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I'm very delighted to be invited into this sort of important spot in the organisation of research and its context in the economy in New Zealand. What I've got are some slides extracted from this evening's lecture, where I was going to run relatively quickly through sort of what I've done, and then expand that out into why these things happen in Cambridge and where that sits in the UK context, because I presume that the sort of purpose of my being here is to perhaps provide an angle on this vexed question of how it is possible to get the right research to happen at the right time, if you don't, and not to fall into the trap of picking winners, which is, of course, the habits of paymasters and governments, and that's the sort of base position. So the title is probably rather overdoing it, and this is just the cover slide from my lectures as I've been going around New Zealand. And I have to say, one of the things that is a huge plus in New Zealand is this appetite, the public appetite, to come and listen to, if you like, practicing scientists. I'm not aware of any possibility of similar numbers of people turning up in the UK. And I think that speaks well of what the Royal Society of New Zealand, among other organisations, has managed to do. It's a fine tradition. So the field I work in is actually a field that came out of Alan McDermott's work. And Alan, of course, spent a lot of time in New Zealand, particularly after he won his Nobel Prize. And the McDermott Institute, I'm very familiar with, which obviously was inspired by the work that he did. So he's actually someone I knew very well. What Alan was very good at doing was wandering into fields where sane men wouldn't dare to tread, because they're pretty. And if you work out what he was awarded his Nobel Prize for, it was really for doing some experiments which, if they thought hard about it, they'd never done in the first place. And the realization that this sort of black, shiny plastic material, which was pretty insulating, could be converted into something which was conducting by treating it chemically with an oxidizing agent, was not a mainstream thing to do at all. And one of the messages that I keep banging on about is that whenever large top-down programs are set in train, they usually have the effect of strangling resource for things that are happening somewhere out in the hinterland where things weren't supposed to happen. And I would say that Alan should be a a good example of blue skies research that didn't fit anybody's preconception of where things were supposed to be happening. This is a message that keeps having to put across. As was mentioned, I'm a council member for our Physical Sciences and Engineering Research Funding Agency, and I'm afraid to say that they are or we are trying to pick winners again. So what I did a long time ago now, in the mid-1980s, was to pick up some of the materials that Alan McDermott, for example, had been looking at as metals. And I was lucky enough to get hold of some materials which were just about clean enough that one can think of them as practical semiconductors. So here is a material which has meant a lot to us. And the chemical structure, for those who like chemistry, is you can see from an alternation of double and single carbon-carbon bonds. Is similar to that you find in graphene, or indeed in all the colourful molecules involved in photosynthesis. And they have, if you like, the propensity to behave as semiconductors, because the colour means that we have accessible energy levels within which we can sort of put more electrons or holes or whatever, so they may behave as semiconductors. So if you like, that is like sort of one of the molecules that nature would use in photosynthesis, but it's longer, and we can put them all together and we can wire them up. So I have to say that the original aim back in the 1980s was not to start a technology, but just to see whether nature's molecules might show silicon-like phenomena. The fact that we've ended up turning out to be quite useful means that we now look like a bit of a misfit within a physics department. We would perhaps naturally be in an engineering department, but if I had been in an engineering department, I would never have started this work, not in the UK. So that sort of sense of a transition from something which was definitely done out of curiosity towards something which became useful that was the unplanned bit. So what turned out to be stuff up in the best way possible imagined, discovered that it was possible painted film down onto a bottom conducting substrate, a transparent conductor in tin oxide on a sheet of glass, and then to evaporate a bit of metal on top. So we have two electrical contacts, we've got a material sandwich in between, and for reasons which I won't wander through now, we put a voltage on, a high enough voltage to pass some current through it, and Jeremy Barrows noticed that light was coming out of it, so we discovered that we had a light-emitting diode made from a semiconductor which we could literally paint in principle over large areas, so it was obviously useful. So it was useful because we had been using like a completely different toolkit for how to make something to that is ordinarily used in the semiconductor world. So silicon, you sort of hew things out of, you slice up single crystals of silicon to make wafers, and then you put lots of functionality in bits of wafer, and you wire them up, and for Intel you make a lot of money. But if you can sort of swap completely the whole paraphernalia of how you make things, and you've got something which has a useful performance, then you've probably got a technology. So we filed a patent, which was unusual in those days, and actually Jeremy Barrows, Donald Bradley, and myself paid for it ourselves, because the university had no mechanism of paying for patents. Didn't mean to say it didn't have an interest in getting a share of it. We paid £1,000 to a very good patent agents in London who saw that as a loss leader. I think the bill for that one patent that they charged is north of £100,000 sometime later. They did very well out of it. So did we. So we filed a patent, and then we published a paper in Nature, which is in the top 20 of most cited papers in Nature. It's heading towards 8,000 citations, so we did well both ways. It wasn't that common to do that in the UK then. It is much more common now to file patents when something looks interesting. This is what they used to look like. This is it's that little visible stripe of light there, a device that is being viewed through a glass window in an evacuated brass cylinder. That's what it, it's a pretty crude experiment. This was not well-funded research. A nice piece of artwork which appeared on the whiteboard behind, which was probably more interesting than a strip of light. We ended up, having found a patent, we formed a company. And why we formed a company is a long story. But approximately, patents all by themselves are valueless. And we discovered that UK industry, wonderful though it was, had zero interest in commercializing a new display technology, because it had just let go of the crystal displays and didn't feel like having another go at something it was going to let go of later. And we sort of, we had the right conversations with them, but understood that we should not give them something they didn't want, because then we'd be dead for certain. So we ended up forming a company, got money from all sorts of very strange places, and miraculously the company sort of survived. Today, it was acquired, it was listed on NASDAQ for a while. It was formed by a Sumitomo chemical company in Japan in 2008. Currently supports 160 jobs in and around Cambridge. It's 20 years later. So why so long? Well, actually, most new advanced materials technologies do take a long time. Silicon took at least that amount of time. The crystal displays took that amount of time. Graphene will probably not take that amount of time. There's just a huge amount to do to, deal with the entire infrastructure of all the different pieces that have to work before a technology is in the marketplace. And what we discovered with our company was that what it was actually set up to do, although we didn't realize it at the outset, was to do the industrialization, the conversion from something that looks all right in the lab, which might last for a few minutes, which is fine to get something published as a letter of nature, to something which will last forever, which 20 years later it does. And that's something which once upon a time might have been comfortably supported within the corporate R&D arm of an integrated big company, but we decided that we don't need those any longer in the UK, and we've had to do so. The model of doing this sort of activity in smaller companies has been well, it's reasonably successful. I think it's been quite successful in some of the life sciences areas. So one of the steps along the way that was important in bringing in investment was the appreciation that one of the things you want to do if you want to make a full colour display is to pattern red, green and blue, which are the primary colours that need to be added together. And that patterning can be done with an inkjet printer if the semiconductor could be like functional ink. So inkjet printing has turned out to be what has been commercialised as the method of deposition. And moment in time, there is a precedent with using organics as semiconductors. Now, of course, it isn't just Cambridge. There was really important work done in Kodak. They, once upon a time, had wonderful corporate labs in Rochester and upstate New York. They use vacuum processing, suggested vacuum evaporations. So if you buy a Samsung smartphone, it has an organic LED display, not a crystal display. It's actually using the vacuum sublime deposition. It's quite hard to pattern, but in some senses it's more conventional in terms of the manufacturing. And that's a several $billion a year business for Samsung already. So that's existing markets. Then there are all sorts of emerging markets, all of which look perfectly plausible. What's been interesting is that I was confidently told 20 years ago that the organics would fail because we wouldn't get enough performance out of them as useful semiconductor devices, and the devices would never live long enough. And the list went on and on and on. and it's all rubbish. It's amazing how good scientists are at saying that the future is not interesting, and we keep doing it. And I have to train myself not to be sniffy about fields that are emerging as well. We are pre-programmed to be rather negative here. So the first line is organic LEDs. Remarkably, they're now very serious contenders for efficient lighting. So you can make a panel rather than a point source, and the efficiencies are now comparable to the best gallium nitride in organic LEDs. And the lighting is expensive, but the price will come down, and it looks like a very good runner for energy efficient lighting. Thin film transistors, I'll say a bit about in a moment, and then where most of the research literature is, because it's sort of fun and will save the planet, is trying to make very cheap solar cells. So I'll say a little bit about the transistors. The attribute with transistors that was sort of interesting with the organics is not that we could make a transistor that was better than silicon. We can't. But we can make it at room temperature. So if you can sort of put transistors onto anything you want to work with, if it's flat enough, well, one or two provisos. These little details are usually what take 20 years of engineering. Then you can sort of take the transistor away from being something that is manufactured at high temperatures onto a sheet of glass, if it's the backplane for a laptop display, to being able to be put onto other things that you might want. And the one that we were particularly interested in was making flexible displays by putting arrays of transistors onto sheets of plastic. So that requires low temperature processing, and that's what we did with our organic transistors. What has been done is to laminate, this is a sort of scheme for those that like these things, of what's required with the transistor on the base and the number of levels of packaging that have to be put on, all put onto a sheet of Coca-Cola bottle plastic, which can then be laminated with the display foil that is used if you have an e-reader like an Amazon Kindle. It's an electrophoretic display foil, which is actually flexible, but instead of currently that's stuck onto a sheet of glass with silicon transistors to address the pixels. We now have a flexible sheet of transistors, I'll go straight on to the movie, which is working, right. So this is actually a reflective colour, showing it sort of jerks when you change the picture, which is a bit like the, that's a characteristic of the e-ink display effect. But you can see it switching while it bends. It's sort of flexible e-paper, and it is literally as thin as it looks. It's just like a laminated card. Now, it isn't quite a roll-up screen because it has to be. We need to sort of have connectors along two edges. So, and actually, by the time you work out what you probably want as a practical device, the real attribute of this is that it doesn't break when you drop it or drop things on it because it's plastic. So it's the, if you like, the opportunity to integrate function into something which is lighter and semi-flexible and not easy to break, which is the issue. So that all looks like just an afternoon's work. In practice, that again, the company we developed to start that, we founded in 2010, so it's 12 years old. And that has turned out to be a sort of integrated company with a manufacturing facility that was built in Germany, which in Germany. I have to say it's been quite a complicated journey. There were one or two times when the technology roadmap stalled for a while, and it's now sorted out. Yield is pretty good, but it's been quite a long process. So the final area of technology is where the research literature is absolutely full of papers, most of which are rehashes of previous papers, but that's the nature of the research literature, is the possibility of making solar cells. And the intellectual attraction or interest in that is that what we're trying to do is, in an extraordinarily crude way, use the first steps in photosynthesis as in green plants. And the clever bit of that nature does is that it deals with the problem that if you absorb light in any of these molecules or polymer chains, they're pretty good at just re-radiating the light, which is why we can make light-emitting diodes. And what they won't do is to allow an electron to go in one direction and the positive charge left behind the hull to head in the other direction. They're just stuck on the same molecule. What nature does is to have molecules with different electron affinities that are sort of bumped up against one another in a very specific way, so that the electron will pop one way and leave the positive charge behind on the first molecule, and then they're shuttled away from one another, and they go off and do chemistry. So the electron does all the reducing that turns carbon dioxide into sugar, and the whole actually is a sort of surplus item, and it's used to oxidize water to make oxygen. It's quite useful for us that it does so. But the first steps are pretty much what have to be in a solar cell. And what has turned out is that some incredibly crude structures work with other materials. They're well enough
Yes.
polymer. What we do is we dissolve it in solvents. And it can be another polymer, but actually quite often it's a derivative of a fullerene because it has useful properties. Put them in the same sort of, just mix them up as, if you like, as a sort of paint with more than one component. Print it down, and the ones which work miraculously self-organize, that we end up with interfingering structures of usually the polymer absorbs light and pushes an electron off onto the fullerene which accepts the electron. And the fingers sort of will wire themselves back to the electrodes above and below, and they work. They're currently up to about 10% power conversion efficiency, which is, if it were 15%, it would be extremely. The proposition there is that we can make super cheap solar cells. It's so easy to say. So the of course, this is just all that little bit of serious engineering to do in between. So the proposition you do start with a cheap rubber plastic substrate, just additively print everything onto it, and out come rolls of solar cell at the end, which clearly are very cheap. Well, they may or may not be, but they don't use much material, and the manufacturing is done at around room temperature, so it feels as though it's a pretty green approach. In fact, we can make them with non-toxic, free of a lot of toxic parts of the periodic table. So there are all sorts of little minor issues, like getting sufficient encapsulation and the efficiency right, and so on and so on. So it's not really a commercial technology today, but there's a huge level of activity around the world. We started a company 2 years ago, late 19, to do this printing. And I just wander off into a small sort of deviation from plastic electronics, which is that one of the exciting things about starting companies is that you have people in who are much smarter than professors are, understanding what customers are. And the thing about companies is that they're not just there to harbour and look after and nurture new technology. They need to find customers who will pay good money. And the problem with renewable energy is that it's an awful market. The solar market has been completely destroyed in the last couple of years by overproduction. If you read the American press in China, and dumping of silicon solar cells. And if a market is so cyclical, it's very hard to place a bet and do a 10-year investment in new technology. It's a real problem in the West. Maybe in places like China, they just sort of plow on through. So we've been quite inventive, I say we, I take no credit for it, in trying to find markets. And the obvious market that people always go for is the built environment. We could laminate these solar cells into the laminated glass, which is used as a building, as a cladding for high-rise buildings anyway. Then the lamination it comes for free. You just get free solar cells. But you'll never persuade any sort of high quality construction outfit or architect to incorporate a technology which has got to carry on working, or at least not sort of discover for at least 25 years, unless it's been around for 25 years. So the construction industry is horribly conservative. It's a dumb place to start trying out new technology. This is nothing to do with science, is it? So the place that we have gone to is the off-grid market. So the little photograph of one of our printed cells, obviously somewhere sunny. I think it's in South Sudan. We have very intrepid people in the company who enjoy going to war zones. And the model is to do what's been done with cell phones. Remarkably, there are, I'm not sure there's an update figure, 750 million cell phones owned by people who don't have mains electricity, which tells you all sorts of things. But one of them is that they own things they couldn't buy outright, because cell phones cost far more than people in the developing world can usually save. And the reason they have them is because they rent them. Pay-as-you-go has been the method that has caused this huge penetration of mobile phones into Africa and India and many other parts of the world. So the great plan with our solar cells is to do the same for electricity. So there are kits that, in principle, people can buy, say in Africa, which involve a solar cell, a battery box, a rechargeable battery, and then some LED lights. So the solar cell charges the battery in the day, and you have free lighting at night. And that's attractive because lighting off-grid is usually with kerosene, which is surprisingly expensive, vastly more expensive than grid electricity. So the great business model is that the battery box has a keypad on it, and you can buy and the ticket purchase is done by sending a text message to the company, who send a text message back with the correct code on it. And at this point, people start smiling and thinking how silly. But I have to remind you that all these people have got a cell phone anyway, and text messages are pretty cheap. And it essentially does the whole transaction, and it then becomes possible to set up a rental model for solar electricity. And that has been trialled quite successfully in Kenya. It's been well liked at the moment. Now, this is miles away from what physics professors do, but it's much more fun than sitting in management meetings. So that's a quick run through like stories of technology. Okay, great. And at some point, you're probably wondering whether I ever did anything back in the university and why they carried on paying my salary, which is a reasonable question to ask. I think you're a taxpayer. But perhaps more relevantly, why do, and I'm not alone, this happens a lot in Cambridge, why do we do it? Well, it's primarily cultural. The university turns out, the virtue of being old is that you never get brought up to date. So, although we appear to have a rule book, statutes and ordinances, which looks like a good-sized telephone directory, it turns out that it doesn't stop you doing anything. So we're all allowed to spend as much time as we want without even telling the university, starting our own companies. As it happened, we had the university treasurer on board of our first company, and the university was a significant shareholder. It's all very much above board. There is also a Cambridge culture, which I think is one of the reasons it's a successful university, which is that we don't put so much pressure on junior faculty to produce instant results, as seems to be the case in North America. So the sort of sense that people quite early in their careers can take fairly big risks and know that they probably won't get thrown out. Again, it's sort of, it's part of that sort of background sense of freedom. So one of the reasons I never left Cambridge is that I never found anywhere else where I felt I could ever have that sense of I can do what I want. I might get paid more, I might in principle have more research support, but the sort of sense that I can take risks, I think is something very special about Cambridge. So what's also happened is that we have science parks. Science parks in Europe started in Cambridge. One of the Cambridge colleges, Trinity, started its science park in the early 70s. And Cambridge has now got 40,000 high-tech jobs. This is a city with a notional population of 100,000. It's a magnet. The economic area is, I mean, Cambridge used to be a market town when I turned up in the 1970s. It's now, it sucks people in. The economic area is 500,000. We have now to support 30,000 high-tech jobs. Probably go college to start it like this. The chapel, the great gate, and the rooms where Newton did his optics experiments. And there is the rather nondescript 150 acres of farm, which they turned into a science park, which makes a fortune for them in rent. And it's utterly changed the city. It is simply not what it was 30 years ago. And it's been hugely successful. So Arm is the company that does the designs for the majority by not just number but by value of microprocessors made. By value, Arm design microprocessors outsell Intel. And it's a Cambridge company. They don't do the silicon bit, but they do the design. Autonomy, which is a data handling sort of Bayesian sort of company that was started in on one of the science parks. HP bought $10 billion last year, or end of this year. There have been some big successes, but of course the majority are small companies. And I think what it has done, I mean, you could say the university has done well because it's pushed all this stuff out, but the really interesting bit is it's the stuff around which is intruding in and pervading the culture of the lives of the grad students and the postdocs, who expect that they will learn about tech transfer, expect that they will probably file a patent or two. And even the philosophers turn up for the evening lectures on entrepreneurship. So it's been, I think it's been absolutely virtuous, although of course happening in the UK was wonderfully unplanned, and central government regards this as an aberration and carries on plowing money into deindustrialised parts of other places. So that was my sort of Cambridge, my own story, which has been sort of interesting, but not that atypical. And I've perhaps rushed through a perception of why that happens in Cambridge. It's also worth saying, of course, that many of the industries that are, if you like, thriving in apparently quite small companies, or companies with relatively few people, are industries that shouldn't all be there. I mean, why should the company that owns the designs for the majority of microprocessors sit in a country that doesn't know how to process away from silicon any longer? If you were sitting in government deciding whether there should be any support for a company like Arm, the answer is no. It's not one of our core industries. We should plow it into whatever, making weapons or something. And I think that message that if you are prescriptive about where clever people can create value, you throw away most of the opportunities. And I can give you an example. I'm not sure that it's for public knowledge, but I have a colleague who's an astronomer who did some clever work sorting galaxies by shape. Apparently that's an important thing to do, and a very large number of them. So he did some very clever, if you like, image analysis work, which turns out to be incredibly valuable for post-operative mammography, where it turns out that it can give much more accurate results about post-operative performance than even biopsy corpses. So you could say, well, he shouldn't have been an astronomer, he should have been in life sciences to start with, but whether he would have done that in an environment where people weren't thinking about sorting galaxies is an interesting question. So that, I would pick that as that's one of many examples where there's this cross-fertilization and this sense that you cannot be prescriptive about where interesting things will happen or where the chance conversations will happen well, I bang on about it, and I think that's part of what makes Cambridge work really well. So UK science funding, I am on the council of the EPSRC, which is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and I sort of volunteered to be on it because I'm not very happy with where things in general are drifting. There's huge pressure from government to give short-term boost to the UK economy, which the bankers managed to wreck. And there's intense pressure that we, if you like, come up with the usefulness of our research before we've done it. And the risk is that we end up with funding people who are very good at producing bullshit, but don't deliver. And the standard problem is that if you set up a rule book, there'll be some people who will win because they'll play by the rules, but whether they'll produce the outcome you really want is quite another question. So we have to produce impact statements when we put in grant proposals to describe who is going to find the research useful. We now have to, and that impact is scored as part of our every 5 or so year assessment of research quality, which is one of the core components of UK university research funding. So impact equals cash or lack of it. And then the Research Council itself does fund a lot of Blue Skies work, but it feels under strong pressure from the government to be able to demonstrate impact. So we have wandered into something which should be called prioritisation, but we seem to go for weasel words, and that's called shaping capability, which is rather confusing. We now have to write our grant proposals against a concept of national importance, all of which is quite serious pressure on, I think, creativity. Actually, I think it's quite a problem. I hope we have basically a pretty good system, which has been rather good at funding people. Not because they're grand, but because they come up with good ideas. But the pressures currently on us. The report was published in 2007. I'll finish with this slide. David Sainsbury, who was Minister for Science and Innovation throughout most of the Blair governments. And he had only one interest. He didn't want further promotion of government. He wanted to be science minister, and he was probably the most successful minister of that 10 years in government. He managed to arrange that there was a progressive reinvestment in the UK science base. In real terms, the university base has twice the funding it had in 1997. And it was done in a sufficiently programmed way that we didn't feel that we had to sort of grab what was going this year, could be nothing next year. It allowed a level of long-term planning, and long-term is absolutely underpins research when it's valuable. If we have to grab what we want, can get them this year because it's going to be a famine next year, we will not do the investments that will produce the big returns. So anyway, this report into the impact of science innovation on the economy contains, of course, lots of information, and I've been selective. But the horizontal axis is the research assessment exercise rating in the 2008 exercise, so it approximately equals quality of Blue Skies research. This is the stuff that gets published in fancy journals. And the vertical axis is the number of venture-backed companies. And you see that there isn't a linear correlation, it's superlinear. And of course, Cambridge is right at the top. entirely unbiased there. But David Sainsbury is a firm proponent of the proposition that the best return in terms of industrialisation for work, government money spent in the universities is blue skies. That when we wander off and do things which are labelled applied, in general, we don't fund the smartest projects and we don't get the smartest people working on them, and the industrial impact is not quite so large. The better bet is to allow the most creative projects that suck in the very brightest people from around the world. Because most of the time when they've done something useful, they want to follow through with it and start their companies. And that is my rather unsubtle message this morning. Thank you.
Well, can I take a few questions?
I hope you've given me lots of opportunities to disagree with me.
Well, I might start. The interpretation of that last slide I think is very interesting. Cambridge is an elite place. You have to convince me that what they do in Cambridge is scalable further across the system, and the University of Middlesbrough or something can do what you're doing at Cambridge. Or Leicester.
That's a reasonable question. I think Cambridge, it helps that it has a reputation, but I think there are some lessons about what happens in Cambridge which are absolutely transferable. One of the things we managed to hang on to was a very liberal IP ownership policy. Many other universities decided this was a cash cow, and so they killed it. Imperial College, which has a draconian level of ownership of IP, which I don't think is a good thing at all. And I think that the university world is global. There are a lot of, Cambridge depends on, very substantially on students who come from all over the world. And we have a reputation. It's up to other universities to build theirs. If you look at what's going on around the world, you can see very concerted efforts to internationalize universities. The two principal universities in Singapore I know very well. They're doing that rather successfully. I think the game is rather open.
Yes.
Just on that previous question, Cambridge is by no means the biggest university in terms of either numbers of PhDs or academics.
No, Manchester and Imperial are significantly larger by those metrics. Of course, Imperial doesn't have humanities, so that numbers are smaller.
I often quote Cavendish as an example of small is beautiful in terms of size, because throughout the world there's been a lot of debate about large science. Do you have any views about that?
Well, it's interesting. If you look, Cambridge is rather sort of flattered by its position in this Shanghai League, and if you look at the other universities in, say, the top 10, the majority is smaller than Cambridge, not larger. Caltech, Harvard, MIT. And I think in the physical sciences, that's definitely true. I keep being told by medics that if you want to have a really effective biomedical research environment, scale is necessary. That's what I'm told. But the quality is what counts. Yeah.
And to touch on talking about the science parts, about the training for the graduates now, focusing more on building an entrepreneurship, do you think that's important, or they just absorb it by the people around them?
I think it does get absorbed. In part, of course, a lot of career options which were once open have gone, so that there are no safe jobs in big industry. And you can see that small companies are relatively respectable. There's also an interesting phenomenon that once you get above a critical mass, the risk that someone takes in working in a small company that hasn't got funding beyond next month is not all that large, because if you're smart and flexible, you're very re-employable. And I won't run through which companies it was that failed, but I'll pick up one, Kodak. Kodak's the remnants of their R&D activity in the UK moved to Cambridge. Wonderful group, only 50 incredibly talented people. Of course, Kodak have now filed bankruptcy. Those people were absorbed within the Cambridge system within a few weeks. So they didn't need to move house to find a new job. So the sort of sense that it may appear on the face of it risky if you measure risk by the likelihood of your small company surviving, but actually it's much less risky because you can move around. I think that's well understood now.
Richard, I think it's also important to point out that all this only started in the 70s. I mean, I left Cambridge after 10 years and went back, and the measure was the fact that the houses in Sedley Taylor Road, which used to be owned by professors at 5 times the professor's salary, now cost £1 million. I mean,
Oh, and the rest, yes.
and so I think the point is that it is something that's happened in a lifetime,
Yes.
rather than being going on forever.
Well, Cambridge might be old, but I know, as in Dunedin yesterday, of course, the University of Otago was founded the same year as the Cavendish Laboratory, which is not all that long ago. Traditions can be built up quite rapidly. But when I picked out Singapore, I just think that the notion that there's a status quo and that there's a pecking order and that it's not going to get rearranged is just not true. New Zealand is such a lovely place to live. I mean, there's huge opportunities for where quality of life is increasingly such a draw.
Really interesting relationship between quality of blue skies research and the number of companies produced. Do you have any sense of what it would look like for the US?
That's complicated. Well, in the US, the system is older. Mike made that rather important point that Cambridge started sort of way after Silicon Valley. So it's slightly harder to sort of disentangle what one university has done to a local economy. But Cambridge is far enough away from London that you can definitely say it's nothing to do with London. But by the time you look at Northern California or MIT in the Boston area, it's a complete sort of infrastructure of, if you like, high value jobs with a highly trained workforce. And one would probably now say that the universities are essential components of it, but one wouldn't necessarily say that they're going to drive the next phase.
I think it's important in the case of MIT that a lot of the high-tech buildings built around there are now in old buildings which were originally making agricultural equipment, which is what they were good at doing 10 years ago, so it has 100 years ago. So it is perfectly possible that in 20, 30 years the contribution to the debate now will have faded or become pervasive, and there'll be a completely different set of issues in front of Cambridge. In fact, it almost certainly will.
Yes, I mean, Cambridge is sort of, we managed to bypass the Industrial Revolution, so it's still quite a small town. So it means there's a significant amount of land which is university owned, which is sort of close enough to the university that it's sort of all happening in what feels like a large village. So that's been an attribute.
Can I just ask a slightly different question, and that's, in addition to research which I could call technology push, there is a place for market pull.
Yes.
And I would argue that the secret of MIT's success as an engineering school is that they've got that particular one size. Where do you see the role for that in the UK? That is, you start out with an identified societal need and say we're going to solve it.
Well, I worry about this quite a lot. I mean, this is a single point of view. I think the problem is you could look at landscape and say we would love to have some wonderful renewable energy technology, so let's start it. And the problem is, how do you nucleate? How do you get that first cluster together with something that appears to be differentiated? And if it's a business plan, it's not differentiated because anyone can come up with the same business plan. They're not special. On the other hand, if you get a bit of technology that if like enthuses maybe people who are naive but nevertheless smart, I think you can get that nucleation, that clustering, and then the smart thing is, and it's something which I've watched happen several times, is that a company might think of itself as a technology push, sort of turns itself inside out and refaces towards the customers, probably draws in experience from powers that know about that, and then off it goes and becomes a proper company. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, but Vodafone is a global company that is UK based. It came out of Racal, which was a company that had leading edge communication technology.
And the company that lost the liquid crystal display industry for the UK.
Did it?
Yes, I'll tell you that one.
Right. Okay, well that's a less good thing about it. But so my answer, I think, is that it's that nucleation problem, and actually that's where, if you like, Blue Sky's research is quite good value at just getting that customer.
Don't get me wrong, I totally agree with that. I just think there is, more than one way of skinning the cat.
Okay.
And
sorry, Klaus, you mentioned the funding system and the changes and joining the council because you thought there was kind of problems.
Yes. I mean, please don't quote me, because that's not being very corporate, is it?
What was your ideal kind of funding system, assuming government is going to provide a significant amount of funding?
Oh, well, in order of priority, it's excellence, excellence, and excellence. There's nothing else that counts. It's a global race, and we have to find whatever way we can to bring in the smartest people and sort out what are the most interesting problems. And then package it up so government thinks it's getting a good deal, but not take our eye off the fact that it's about excellence. Okay.
So within excellence then, how would you measure, apart from citations and peer review, how do you measure the impacts of intellectual, like IP, patents?
Well, these are all trailing indicators by about 10 years. You have to place bets. You have to catch things before they've happened, which means, you can't use metadata. You have to go down and read papers that people have written, and know just how creative people that start their careers are being, work out whether they're copying something done somewhere else or whether this is actually their own idea. It's hard work, but you can do it.
So this is picking winners in terms of people rather than technology?
Of course. It's all about people. I mean, I hope that came through, that the Blue Sky's research is about finding the best people and then getting them to perform at a level beyond what they might have managed in another environment. And then they're around. They'll carry on being creative, and they won't stick. They're not going to want to sort of moulder in a university.
Take 3 questions.
There is an emerging market for patents around the world. Sort of the biggest sale was Nortel Networks for $4.5 billion, but Kodak's put up its patents too. Is Cambridge in that sort of a game?
No,
in other words,
categorically not. I mean, the reason for patenting in a university is that it's the only way of hanging on to something valuable, because of course we allow grad students to go and work for the opposition, don't we? Which means we have to reinvent what we do, moving. And patenting in Cambridge is done in quite a limited way. It is not done as a sort of blanket activity, because that would take much time and cost far too much money. In order to get the university to agree to pick up the costs of finding a patent, they need to have been told by you who you think might buy it or license it.
but a commercial partner might then come in and say, hey, we want this, this, this.
That's a different story. But a patent is a tool, not an end.
So you don't have any.
We don't like sort of owning in the sense of having to carry the costs of maintaining. So generally speaking, the costs would be sort of offshored with a licensee or a sale of a patent.
I was interested that you set up a number of companies, so for each sort of technology idea.
Not entirely by myself.
Well, no,
involved in doing it.
For each technology you've developed, you've set up a separate company rather than putting them in trying to create something larger.
Yes. That is very common in the sort of VC-backed small company world. I mean, logically, they could all have happened inside one large company, but in small companies, small companies seem to have one thing in common, which is that they all come perilously close to failing on a fairly regular basis, and it's all hands to the task that is going to take the company through. So it's very difficult to manage, if you like, different stages of technology development in a small company. It's often better to split them out. Maybe one day they might come back together again, but that's the logic.
Thinking about your 819 example and
Yes.
the picture you had of the customer in
Yes.
Africa somewhere,
Yes.
has your thinking about research questions changed through your career? Because, I mean, earlier in your presentation you talked about room temperature of materials. Well, a room temperature in eastern Ethiopia is interesting.
Yes.
So, and presumably these products do have slightly different behaviours, do they? So does that, do you get feedback, my question is, do you get feedback through these companies? Because in New Zealand sometimes the dialogue between business and science isn't as good as it could be. So what are your thoughts about engaging that sort of discussion?
I sort of hinted that it's the input back from the companies at the university which is actually really valuable, and the proposition that the interesting research problems are things that we think of when we're sitting at our desks in the university is a very restricted and outmoded view. You have to go looking for where there is, if you like, empirical information often, which is waiting to have some science done to it. My predecessor, Sam Edwards, who started life as a particle physicist, wandered into the field of rheology of polymers, and he and it was Duchenne is the Nobel Prize winner, but they essentially saw deep statistical mechanics as underpinning how plastics sort of shear and don't. And they did it by going out into messy old and finding data sets. And I think that's really, it's a message that sometimes gets forgotten. So having industry on the doorstep is great.
Yeah, I know that the UK is going through a process of slashing government research funding.
Well, slashing is probably overstating it. We haven't
Isn't
managed
it
to
down by
destroy the
25%?
system yet.
No.
Yes,
No.
It is in some
It's
ways.
The current period we're flat in sterling, which means given inflation we're probably about 10% down, but we're still massively up from where we were in real terms, say around 10,000. So we've gone up steadily, and we're sort of doing that.
This is in this area of science.
That is the Research Council spend is falling a bit, but compared with what's happening to other areas of public sector spending like defence, we've been let off very, very lightly.
Right.
My beef is that we keep our nerve about doing the things which are of long-term benefit, rather than lip service to things which won't then work.
Well, here's a hypothetical question then. If it was cut significantly, say
Yes.
by 25%,
Yes.
what kind of impact would that have on your success in what you're doing in Cambridge? How dependent are you on that money from government?
We're very dependent. As it happens, we're starting to get very significant funding out of Brussels. There is a European Research Council, which for the time being appears not to be interfered with geopolitically, and things are funded on the basis of merit, which is why Cambridge is the most successful. Cambridge does as well as all the Fraunhofers put together. Is way at the top of the universities in Europe at bringing money from the European Research Council. So that's starting to make a big impact. But we could never, the notions of universities being able to decouple themselves from government are ridiculous. The core funding has got to be there. And the private wealth we have helps, but it goes nowhere near addressing that.
Let's go there first.
I'm interested in, we've talked about the science and where you're getting the science ideas from. To actually see it into a business, you need the entrepreneurs and the business people.
Yes.
What's the source of those people, and what's the marriage like?
The source is usually people who've done it before, and of course they have to start somewhere. But in Cambridge, if you've got some technology you think's interesting, you just sort of put your hand up. And the very good community of business angels who they're almost like the sort of 18th century Berlin society, is a bit like the Lunar Society. They see, they meet, they discuss propositions out of a sense of both citizenly duty, but also intellectual curiosity. And there's just a wonderful environment where the message is that you can carry on being a professor. All the other bits can be supplied by professionals.
I'm interested in how you would put your message into a New Zealand context where we don't have any highly ranked universities and our economy is based on having highly efficient primary industries. How do you reconcile those things?
Well, I think one should be careful not to generalise, and there are pockets always of excellence, and one needs to understand why they work and see if that can be replicated. I don't know New Zealand at all well, but the film industry and the software around video imaging and so on, I'm told is going very well. I was immensely impressed. I was fortunate enough when I visited New Zealand last year to meet Paul Callahan, and what he was doing, I think, was just deeply impressive. His company is, it's small, but a wonderful example of success. My own view is that there's a sort of, things are pretty global. Communication, of course, is now much easier. And if you look where smart people are, it's usually where the quality of life is good. And the quality of life measured, it's a complex set of metrics. We wouldn't say that Cambridge has a beautiful climate, and we're overrun with tourists and flights is too expensive. But it's that quality of freedom which I think makes the place tick.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I ask you to thank again.